The gavel struck the mahogany block, its sharp crack echoing through the cavernous space of courtroom 302. Richard adjusted his custom Italian silk tie, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips as he cast a sidelong glance at the woman he had spent a decade systematically breaking down. He thought he was leaving her completely destitute. He truly believed the paltry $1,500 a month he was offering in spousal support was an act of supreme, untouchable charity. He was the breadwinner, the kingmaker, the man who held all the cards. But as the bank representative adjusted his microphone and read the astronomical account balances into the public court record, the color drained entirely from Richard's face. The silence that gripped the courtroom wasn't just heavy. It was the deafening sound of an arrogant man's reality shattering into a million pieces. The morning rain lashed against the tall, arched windows of the Cook County Courthouse, casting a gray, dismal light over the proceedings. But inside courtroom 302, Richard Sterling felt nothing but sunshine. At 42, he was the picture of corporate success, immaculately groomed, clad in a charcoal Bryony suit that cost more than his soon-to-be ex-wife's entire wardrobe, and radiating the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had outsmarted the world. Beside him sat Harrison Caldwell, a high-priced, aggressively slick divorce attorney known around the city for leaving spouses with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Caldwell was currently shuffling through a stack of meticulously forged financial affidavits. Across the wide aisle, sitting at the petitioner's table, was Clara. Even now, at the bitter end of their 10-year marriage, Richard couldn't help but feel a flicker of disdain as he looked at her. Clara wore a simple, unbranded beige cardigan over a modest navy blouse. Her brown hair was tied back in a practical, unadorned knot. She looked exactly as she always had, plain, quiet, and entirely unremarkable. For the entirety of their marriage, Richard had treated her as part of the furniture. While he climbed the ranks as a vice president of acquisitions at a ruthless commercial real estate firm, Clara had stayed home. She volunteered at the local historical society, spent hours in her small home office doing data entry for what Richard assumed was pocket change, and made sure his dry cleaning was picked up. When Richard had filed for divorce 6 months ago, he hadn't done it gently. He had carelessly dropped the papers on the kitchen island while Clara was making dinner, casually mentioning that his 26-year-old marketing director, Brittany, was pregnant and moving into their primary residence by the end of the month. Richard had planned this exit strategy flawlessly. Over the past 2 years, he had quietly siphoned off nearly $800,000 in corporate bonuses, funneling them through a shell corporation into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. On paper, his net worth appeared heavily depleted by bad market investments and business restructuring. He had successfully painted himself as a man on the brink of financial ruin, scraping by on his base salary. "All rise!" the bailiff bellowed, snapping Richard out of his reverie. Honorable Judge Arthur Pendleton, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for a short temper, took the bench. He adjusted his reading glasses, peering down at the sprawling dockets before him. "We are here for the matter of Sterling v. Sterling, dissolution of marriage and division of assets. Are both parties ready to proceed?" "Ready, Your Honor," Caldwell boomed, buttoning his suit jacket as he stood. "Ready, Your Honor," replied Josephine Reed, Clara's attorney. Josephine was a sharp-featured woman in her late 50s, wearing an understated gray pantsuit. Richard had laughed when Clara hired her. Josephine's firm was a small, boutique operation, nothing compared to the towering glass skyscraper where Caldwell's firm occupied 3 entire floors. "Mr. Caldwell, you may proceed with your opening," Judge Pendleton instructed, leaning back in his leather chair. Caldwell practically strutted to the center of the room. "Your Honor, this is an incredibly straightforward case, despite opposing counsel's attempts to drag it out through needless discovery requests. My client, Richard Sterling, has been the sole financial provider for the entirety of this 10-year union. Mrs. Sterling has not held a formal, W-2 paying job since the day they were wed." Richard watched Clara out of the corner of his eye. She didn't flinch. She was just staring at her hands, neatly folded on the wooden table. Pathetic, he thought. She still doesn't get what's about to happen to her. Unfortunately, Your Honor, Caldwell continued, his voice dripping with faux sympathy, Mr. Sterling's industry has taken a massive hit. His assets are tied up in severely depreciated real estate holdings. He simply does not have the liquid capital to support the lifestyle Mrs. Sterling feels entitled to. We are proposing a clean break, a lump sum of $20,000 and temporary rehabilitative alimony of $1,500 a month for a period of 18 months, after which Mrs. 100 Sterling will be expected to support herself. Lot. Bulb. So, Judge Pendleton frowned, looking at the affidavits. Mr. Caldwell, your client earned over $400,000 3 years ago. You're telling me he is now virtually insolvent? The market is a cruel mistress, Your Honor, Caldwell said smoothly, returning to his seat. Very well, the judge sighed. Miss Reed, your opening? Josephine Reed stood up slowly. She didn't walk to the center of the room. She merely stood behind her chair, a perfectly calm expression on her face. Your Honor, we will waive our opening statement. We simply wish to call our first witness. Richard scoffed under his breath. Caldwell leaned over and whispered, They have nothing. They're going to call her sister to cry about how mean you were. Relax. Call your witness, Ms. Reed, the judge permitted. The respondent calls Thomas Whitfield to the stand, Josephine announced, her voice ringing clear across the quiet courtroom. Richard frowned. He didn't know a Thomas Whitfield. He racked his brain, wondering if this was one of the offshore bankers he had used, a sudden spike of panic hitting his chest. Had they found the Cayman account? Now that was impossible. He had used 3 layers of shell companies. It was bulletproof. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and a tall, distinguished man in his early 60s walked down the central aisle. He wore a meticulously tailored navy suit and carried a thick, locking leather briefcase. He didn't look like a friend, a family member, or a private investigator. He looked like old money. The bailiff swore the man in, and he took his seat in the witness box, setting the briefcase carefully on his lap. Please state your name and occupation for the record, Josephine Reed said, stepping out from behind her desk for the first time. Thomas Whitfield, the man replied, his voice deep and measured. I am the Senior Vice President of Private Wealth Management at Wellington and Hurst Financial. Richard felt the air stalled in his lungs. Wellington and Hurst was one of the most exclusive, high-barrier private banks in the world. They didn't even accept clients with a net worth of less than $10 million. Richard had actually applied to open an account with them 5 years ago and had been politely but firmly rejected. What on earth was one of their senior executives doing in this courtroom? Caldwell was on his feet instantly. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. We have already submitted Mr. Sterling's comprehensive financial disclosures. Opposing counsel is clearly attempting a desperate fishing expedition into institutions my client has zero affiliation with. Your Honor, Josephine countered calmly, Mr. Whitfield is not here to testify regarding Mr. Sterling's finances. Judge Pendleton raised an eyebrow. Then whose finances is he here to discuss, Counselor? My client's, Your Honor. Clara Sterling. A beat of absolute stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Richard actually let out an involuntary sharp laugh. Clara? Clara who clipped coupons for laundry detergent. Clara who drove a 6-year-old Honda Civic because she said it was reliable? Overruled, the judge said, his curiosity clearly piqued. Proceed, Miss Reed. Josephine smiled politely at the witness. Mr. Whitfield, can you confirm that Wellington and Hurst manages a portfolio for Clara Jenkins Sterling? Yes, we do. Thomas answered, flicking open the golden latches of his briefcase and withdrawing a thick, notarized ledger. "We have managed Mrs. Sterling's primary portfolio for just over 11 years. Richard's brow furrowed. 11 years? That was a year before they got married. And can you describe the nature of this portfolio?" Josephine asked, pacing slowly in front of the jury box, though this was a bench trial. "Certainly," Thomas replied, reading from the top document. "The portfolio is structured primarily under a blind trust, legally established as the C.J. Horizon Trust, of which Mrs. Clara Sterling is the sole beneficiary and active director. The trust encompasses 3 primary divisions: a liquid capital management account, a diversified index and blue-chip stock portfolio, and an aggressive private equity tier that specializes in early-stage tech seed funding." Richard's mouth was suddenly terribly dry. He looked over at his wife. Clara was no longer staring at her hands. She was looking directly at him, her eyes utterly devoid of emotion, cold and sharp as obsidian. Mr. Whitfield," Josephine continued, her tone conversational but piercing, "pursuant to the subpoena issued for full financial transparency in this divorce proceeding, can you please read the current up-to-date balances of these 3 accounts into the official court record?" Caldwell leaped up again, his face flushing red. "Your Honor, I must strongly object. We were not provided with these specific documents during the preliminary discovery phase, because you waived standard discovery to expedite the trial, Mr. Caldwell," Josephine snapped back, cutting him off with surgical precision. "You were so eager to push this divorce through and leave my client with pennies that you signed the waiver on the record 3 months ago. I have the transcripts right here. Judge Pendleton looked down at his notes, a grim smile touching his lips. "She's right, Mr. Caldwell. You waived. You wanted a speedy trial. You've got one. Sit down. I want to hear these numbers." Caldwell sank back into his chair, looking like he had just been struck by a physical blow. Richard grabbed his lawyer's arm, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric. "What is going on?" Richard hissed frantically. "What is she doing?" "Shut up and listen," Caldwell whispered, terrified. "Mr. Whitfield, whenever you are ready," Josephine prompted. Thomas Whitfield cleared his throat. "As of 9 a.m. this morning, when the markets opened, the balances are as follows. Account 1, the liquid cash reserve, $4,212,600. Not a doctor," Richard gasped aloud. $4 million? In liquid cash. Account 2, Whitfield continued, completely unbothered by the sudden chaotic murmuring in the room. The diversified index and blue-chip holdings, $14,850,210. "My God," the court stenographer whispered, her fingers flying across the keys. "And finally, account 3, Whitfield said, turning to a final heavily stamped page. The private equity tier, which recently saw significant liquidity events due to the acquisition of 2 startup ventures Mrs. Sterling seeded 5 years ago. Current valuation $32,500,000. The judge pulled his glasses off his face, staring openly at Clara. "For a combined total portfolio value," Whitfield concluded, looking up from the ledger, "of $51,562,810. Richard Sterling couldn't breathe. The courtroom was spinning. He felt a cold sweat break out across the back of his neck. $51 million. His plain, quiet, boring wife, who he had just tried to buy off with a $20,000 settlement, was worth $51 million. "Your Honor," Josephine Reed said into the stunned silence, her voice ringing like a bell tolling a funeral dirge for Richard's entire existence. "As the court can see, my client does not require Mr. Conesta Sterling's pathetic $1,500 a month. In fact, we are fully prepared to decline any spousal support whatsoever." We are simply here to legally unbind her from a man who has financially and emotionally abused her for a decade. Richard's shock rapidly morphed into something else entirely. Greed. Pure, unadulterated greed. The sheer panic he felt seconds ago was instantly replaced by a blinding euphoric calculation. If she had $51 million, and they were married without a prenuptial agreement, half of that was his, $25 million. Richard didn't care about his hidden Cayman account anymore. He didn't care about the real estate firm. He forcefully grabbed Caldwell's shoulder, practically pulling the lawyer out of his chair. "Get Hearth," Richard hissed, his eyes wide and manic as he stared at Clara. "We don't have a prenup. I want half of every single penny she has." Caldwell, ever the shark, recovered his composure. He stood up, adjusting his tie, a predatory smile returning to his face. "Your Honor, the petitioner would like to request a brief recess to re-evaluate our position regarding the equitable distribution of marital assets." But Clara's lawyer didn't look worried. In fact, Josephine Reed looked like a spider who had just watched a fly step perfectly into the center of her web. "We have no objection to a recess, Your Honor," Josephine said softly. "But Mr. Caldwell should know before he goes calculating his client's newfound windfall. There is a very specific reason Mrs. Sterling's assets were never commingled with her husband's." Clara finally smiled. It was a terrifying expression. "And what reason is that, Miss Reed?" Judge Pendleton asked. "Because, Your Honor," Josephine said, picking up a document from her table. "Under the laws of this state, assets acquired through inheritance prior to a marriage and maintained strictly in a separate uncommingled blind trust remain sole and separate property. That is merely the beginning of Mr. Sterling's problems today." The 15-minute recess felt like a lifetime to Richard Sterling. He paced the length of the echoing marble hallway outside courtroom 302, his phone pressed to his ear, ignoring the frantic calls from his office. Harrison Caldwell, his attorney, stood by the tall windows, feverishly scrolling through state legal precedents on his tablet. "Listen to me, Richard," Caldwell said, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "If that money was inherited before the marriage and never moved out of that specific blind trust, it's untouchable. The law in this state is ironclad on uncommingled inheritance. I don't care about the law." Richard hissed, gripping Caldwell by the lapels of his suit, completely abandoning his polished corporate persona. "She hid $50 million from me for 10 years. That's fraud. That's marital deception. You get back in there and you tell the judge she's a lying sociopath, and I am entitled to half." Caldwell roughly swatted Richard's hands away. "Get a grip, Sterling. She didn't hide it. She just never volunteered the information, and since you never bothered to ask her about her finances, assuming she was just your dependent, she never had to lie. You're the one who pushed to waive the prolonged discovery phase because you wanted this done before your girlfriend starts showing. This is on you." The heavy wooden doors creaked open, and the bailiff gestured for them to return. As Richard took his seat, his eyes locked onto Clara. She was drinking water from a paper cup, looking as though she were waiting for a bus rather than dismantling a man's life. The sheer indignity of it, that this plain woman in a beige cardigan had outmaneuvered him, burned a hole through his stomach. Judge Pendleton struck his gavel, settling the murmurs in the gallery. "We are back on the record. Mr. Reed Caldwell, have you conferred with your client regarding the respondent's financial disclosures?" Caldwell stood, buttoning his jacket, attempting to project a confidence he no longer possessed. "We have, Your Honor, and while we are certainly surprised by Mrs. Sterling's hidden wealth, it does not change the fundamental nature of equitable distribution. We argue that Mrs. Sterling deliberately acted in bad faith by concealing these assets, thereby depriving my client of the marital standard of living he was entitled to." Josephine Reed didn't even stand up. She simply leaned toward her microphone. "Your Honor, case law in remarriage of Preston clearly dictates that a spouse has no legal obligation to commingle separate, Premarital inheritance. My client lived modestly because she chose to and because Mr. Sterling insisted on controlling all the joint household finances. Furthermore, Mr. Caldwell is throwing stones from a glass house. If we want to discuss bad faith and concealment, I would like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit C. Josephine pulled a thick bound folder from her briefcase and handed copies to the bailiff, who distributed them to the judge and to Caldwell. "What is this, Miss Reed?" Judge Pendleton asked, adjusting his reading glasses. "That, Your Honor, is a comprehensive financial forensic report compiled by FTI Consulting, one of the premier financial investigation firms in the country," Josephine stated, finally standing up and walking to the center of the room. "Mr. Mife downed him disturbed. Sterling has claimed extreme financial hardship. He submitted sworn affidavits to this court stating his net worth had plummeted due to market volatility, leaving him with roughly $40,000 in liquid assets." Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. FTI Consulting. He knew that name. His firm used them to audit hostile acquisitions. During her free time, Josephine continued, her voice ringing with deadly clarity. "My client, Mrs. Sterling, did not merely volunteer at the Historical Society. She has a master's degree in applied mathematics, a fact her husband routinely forgot. Over the last 2 years, she began noticing discrepancies in the mail, odd routing numbers on banking statements left on the kitchen counter, and encrypted folders on their shared home network. Not so it was that sorrowful. Richard's hands began to shake. He looked at Clara. She met his gaze, her expression placid. "Mrs. Sterling hired FTI Consulting 9 months ago," Josephine told the court. "If you turn to page 4 of the exhibit, you will see a detailed trace of nearly $820,000 in corporate bonuses earned by Mr. Pugh Sterling. These funds never entered his domestic accounts. Instead, they were routed through a Delaware LLC named Apex Holdings, a shell company registered to a P.O. box." "Objection!" Caldwell shouted, jumping to his feet, his face pale. "This is unverified information obtained outside the scope of—" "I have the wire transfer receipts, Your Honor," Josephine interrupted keenly, holding up a stack of papers. "Subpoenaed, legally from Mr. Conan Tude, Sterling's employer, directly. The funds were then moved from Delaware to a private offshore account at Cayman National Bank." She turned slowly to look at Richard. "An account solely in Mr. Sterling's name." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could hear the hum of the HVAC system. Judge Pendleton looked up from the dossier. The veins in his neck were visibly pulsing. He glared down at Richard with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Mr. Caldwell, are you aware that your client signed a sworn financial affidavit under penalty of perjury?" Caldwell swallowed hard, physically stepping a few inches away from Richard. "Your Honor, I was not made aware of these specific offshore vehicles." "They aren't vehicles, Mr. Caldwell. They are a felony," the judge barked, slamming his hand flat on the mahogany desk. "Mr. Sterling, you sat in my courtroom and swore under oath that you were virtually insolvent. You attempted to use the authority of this court to leave your wife destitute while you were sitting on nearly $1 million in hidden, untaxed offshore accounts." "Your Honor, it was a business investment," Richard stammered, his voice cracking, panic stripping away his polish. "It was just a temporary hold for a real estate venture." "Do not speak to me," Judge Pendleton roared, the sound echoing like thunder. "You do not speak unless spoken to, Mr. Bowen. Sterling, you have committed perjury in my courtroom. You have filed fraudulent financial documents." "Loud. Now, Richard collapsed back into his chair, gasping for air. The walls of the courtroom felt like they were closing in. He had planned this so perfectly. He was supposed to walk out of here a free man, with his wealth intact, ready to start his new life with Brittany. Instead, he was staring down the barrel of a criminal investigation. "Your Honor," Josephine Reed said, a voice a calm, soothing contrast to the judge's fury. "There is one final matter regarding the division of assets. The primary residence on Elm Street." Richard snapped his head up. "This Cuddy?" "The house, the beautiful four-bedroom colonial in the suburbs. That was his sanctuary. It was where Brittany was currently picking out paint colors for the nursery." "According to Mr. Sterling's proposed settlement," Josephine noted, referencing Caldwell's original filing, "he demands sole ownership of the marital home, claiming that he made all the mortgage payments during the course of the marriage. He graciously offered Mrs. Sterling 30 days to vacate. Given his perjury, I am inclined to award the house entirely to your client, Miss Reed." Judge Pendleton growled, still glaring at Richard. "That won't be necessary, Your Honor." Josephine smiled, a sharp, terrifying thing. "Because Mr. Sterling doesn't own the house." Caldwell looked baffled. "Your Honor, the deed is in both of their names. There is a standard 30-year fixed mortgage through Chase Bank." "There was a standard mortgage through Chase Bank," Josephine corrected. 3 years ago, Master Gyro Sterling wanted to refinance to pull equity out for what he claimed were renovations. However, his credit had taken a hit due to some highly leveraged, risky margin calls he made on his personal brokerage account. Chase denied the refinance. Richard vaguely remembered this. He had been furious. He had told Clara to handle the paperwork to find an alternative lender while he traveled for business. "Mrs. Sterling did find a private lender," Josephine explained. "A private equity firm specializing in real estate debt acquisitions called Horizon Holdings." Richard's stomach plummeted to the floor. Horizon. C.J. Horizon Trust. "Mrs. Sterling's trust quietly purchased the debt," Josephine said, handing the final piece of paper to the bailiff. "The mortgage on the Elm Street property is held entirely by a subsidiary of my client's trust. Furthermore, because Mr. Sterling was so heavily leveraged and desperate for the cash out, he signed an addendum." Josephine paused, letting the silence stretch, savoring the kill. The addendum stated that in the event of a divorce filing, the entire remaining balance of the mortgage, $750,000, becomes immediately due in full. A balloon payment clause, a clause Mr. Sterling signed without reading, assuming his quiet, obedient wife had simply found him a good deal. Judge Pendleton let out a low whistle, leaning back in his chair. "A masterclass, Miss Reed." "Thank you, Your Honor. As Mr. Sterling has just stated under oath that his liquid assets amount to barely $40,000, since we all know he cannot legally access his illegal offshore money without triggering an IRS audit, he is in immediate default." Josephine looked directly at Richard, her eyes devoid of pity. "My client is initiating foreclosure proceedings at noon today. Mr. Sterling and any other unauthorized occupants have 72 hours to vacate the premises." Richard was paralyzed. His brain couldn't process the sheer velocity of his destruction. His hidden money was trapped. If he touched it, the IRS and the court would have him arrested for perjury and tax evasion. His job was likely gone. When the court reported his offshore accounts, his real estate firm would fire him instantly to avoid the scandal. And now he was homeless. Brittany was waiting for him at the house. Brittany, who loved his money, his cars, and his status. How was he going to explain to his 26-year-old pregnant mistress that they were being evicted by the plain, boring wife he had mocked for 10 years? Clara finally stood up. She smoothed down her beige cardigan. She looked at Richard, not with anger, not with triumph, but with an absolute chilling indifference. He was nothing to her now. He was just a bad investment she had finally liquidated. "Your Honor," Josephine concluded, closing her briefcase, "we request the immediate dissolution of this marriage, the forfeiture of any claim Mr. Sterling has to my client's separate trust, and we ask that you forward the transcripts of today's proceedings to the District Attorney's Office for review of Mr. Mandia's Sterling's perjury." Judge Pendleton didn't hesitate. He raised his gavel. Granted on all counts. Mr. Sterling, I highly advise you to retain a criminal defense attorney. You are going to need one. We are adjourned. The gavel slammed down, echoing through the room with finality. It was the sound of Richard's entire world collapsing, perfectly orchestrated by the woman he had foolishly believed was nothing at all. The drive from the Cook County Courthouse to the affluent suburb of Oakbrook usually took Richard 45 minutes. Today it felt like an eternity suspended in a vacuum. He gripped the leather steering wheel of his Mercedes-Benz until his knuckles turned bone white, his mind violently rejecting the reality of the last 2 hours. It had to be a nightmare. Clara, his mousy coupon-clipping wife, could not possibly be a multi-millionaire. She could not possibly hold the mortgage to his house. She could not possibly have handed him over to the district attorney on a silver platter. But the heavy, suffocating weight in his chest told him otherwise. He pulled into the sprawling paver-stone driveway of the Elm Street house. It was a magnificent 4-bedroom colonial, flanked by manicured oak trees and a pristine lawn. It was the ultimate symbol of his success, and in exactly 72 hours he would be trespassing if he set foot on the grass. Richard killed the engine and sat in the silence of the garage for a long moment, trying to steady his breathing. He had to figure out a plan. He had to call a criminal defense attorney. But first, he had to face Brittany. He opened the door to the mudroom and immediately heard the upbeat tempo of a pop song playing from the kitchen's smart speakers. As he walked into the massive marble-countered kitchen, he found Brittany. She was 26, stunningly beautiful, with long blonde extensions and a perfectly curated athleisure outfit that highlighted her slight baby bump. She was standing at the island, unboxing a mountain of expensive deliveries, a designer bassinet, custom monogrammed silk blankets, and a stack of luxury maternity clothes. "Hey, babe," she chirped, barely looking up from a $1,000 stroller she was admiring. "You're home early. How did it go with the ball? Did the judge sign off on the 20 grand? Because I was looking at that interior designer from Vogue to do the nursery, and she requires a hefty retainer." Richard felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He looked at the mountain of cardboard boxes. "Brittany, put the scissors down." She paused, catching the raw, hollow tone of his voice. She looked up, her smile faltering as she took in his pale, sweat-sheen face. "Richard, what's wrong? Are you sick?" "Nah, we didn't win," Richard choked out, leaning heavily against the granite countertops. Brittany scoffed, rolling her eyes. "What do you mean, you didn't win? Harrison Caldwell is a shark." Did she cry to the judge? "What did they bump the alimony up to?" 2,000, whatever, we can afford it once your bonus is clear." "Brittany, listen to me," Richard snapped, his voice cracking with rising hysteria. "There is no alimony. There is no settlement. Clara is worth $50 million. Brittany froze. The shiny pair of designer shears slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the marble. "What? What are you talking about?" "She has a trust fund," Richard said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "She's had it since before we met. It was legally separated. We don't get a dime of it. But that's not the worst part." Brittany's blue eyes widened in horror. How could there be a worse part than missing out on $50 million? "Because she hired forensic accountants," he whispered, the reality finally breaking his composure. A single tear of pure terror leaked from his eye. "They found the Cayman account, Brittany. They found the shell company. They gave the wire transfers to the judge. The offshore money." Brittany gasped, taking a step back as if Richard had suddenly become contagious. "But you said that was untraceable. You swore it was safe. That's the money for the house. That's the money for my maternity leave." Now what's so on them? "The judge is sending the transcripts to the district attorney," Richard continued, unable to stop the verbal bleeding. I perjured myself on my financial affidavits. I can't touch that money now, or the IRS will seize it and the feds will arrest me. And the house. He looked around the beautiful sunlit kitchen, his sanctuary. Clara's trust bought the mortgage 3 years ago. I triggered a balloon payment clause. We are in default. Default. Brittany's voice pitched into a shrill shriek. What does that mean, Richard? It means we are being evicted. We have to be out in 72 hours. Before Brittany could even process the catastrophe, Richard's cell phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He pulled it out. The caller ID read, Gregory Pierce, CEO. Richard's stomach plummeted completely. He answered it with a trembling hand. Gregory. Sterling, you absolute fool. Gregory's voice barked through the receiver, dripping with venom. I just got a call from the corporate legal team at Chase. The court subpoenaed your employment contracts and bonus structures. Your divorce proceedings just became a matter of public record, including the fact that you actively used a fake Delaware LLC to funnel corporate money to the Caymans. Gregory, please, I can explain. Save it for the federal investigators, Richard. You are fired. Effective immediately. You are barred from the building. Your access cards have been deactivated, and pursuant to the morality and ethics clause in your executive contract, your unvested stock options are officially null and void. Do not ever contact me or this firm again. The line went dead. Richard slowly lowered the phone. He was ruined, utterly, comprehensively ruined. No job, no money, impending criminal charges, and homeless. He looked up at Brittany, desperate for a lifeline, for some semblance of support. But Brittany was already moving. She wasn't walking toward him to offer a comforting embrace. She was marching past him, heading straight for the master bedroom. Brittany, where are you going? He asked, his voice pathetic and weak. I am packing my bags, she yelled back over her shoulder. You lied to me. You told me you were a master of the universe, Richard. You told me we were going to be rich. We will figure this out, he pleaded, stumbling after her down the hallway. I just need to find a good lawyer. We can liquidate some of your designer bags to pay a retainer. Brittany spun around, her face twisted in absolute disgust. Are you insane? You think I'm setting my Birkins to keep you out of federal prison? I am 26 years old, Richard. I am not spending the prime of my life living in a motel, visiting my broke, disgraced boyfriend behind glass. You're pregnant with my child. He screamed, panic finally turning into rage. And I'll be suing you for child support. She screamed back, Oh, wait! You don't have a job. You don't have anything. They tartulai. She slammed the bedroom door in his face. Richard stood in the empty hallway, the silence of the house pressing down on him. The perfectly constructed illusion of his life had been dismantled in a matter of hours, leaving nothing but the pathetic, empty reality of what he truly was. Across the city, far removed from the screaming matches and shattering glass of the Elm Street suburbs, Clara Sterling sat in the opulent, wood-paneled conference room of Wellington and Hearst Financial. The room smelled of old leather, expensive coffee, and victory. She had shed the plain beige cardigan in the back of the limousine ride-over. Underneath, she wore a beautifully tailored charcoal-gray Oscar de la Renta sheath dress that fit her perfectly. She pulled the simple, elastic band from her hair, letting the rich brown waves fall in a sophisticated sweep around her shoulders. She looked at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman in total control. Josephine Reed sat at the massive mahogany tables sorting through the final foreclosure documents, a satisfied smirk on her face. Beside her sat Thomas Whitfield, pouring 3 glasses of exceptionally rare vintage champagne. I must admit, Clara, Thomas said, his deep voice rumbling with amusement as he handed her a crystal flute. In my 30 years of wealth management, I have never seen a financial execution quite so flawlessly orchestrated. It was a masterpiece. Clara took the glass, her eyes cold but satisfied. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for your performance today. The look on his face when you read the private equity valuation was worth every penny of your management fees. To be fair, Josephine chimed in, raising her glass, I only lit the match. You built the bomb, Clara. You built it for 3 years. Clara sat down at the head of the table, taking a slow sip of the champagne. It tasted like freedom. My grandfather was a very wise man, Clara began, her voice steady and smooth, entirely devoid of the meekness she had projected for a decade. When he left me the oil and logistics fortune, he attached a very specific letter to the trust. He warned me that money attracts parasites. He told me that if I wanted to find a partner who truly loved me, I should never let them know the extent of my wealth until I was absolutely certain of their character. And Richard passed the initial test. Josephine asked, leaning forward. He did, Clara nodded, a trace of bitterness shadowing her features. When we met, he was ambitious, charming, and seemed to genuinely care for me. I played the role of the quiet, supportive wife because I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I could buy. But power changes people, or rather, it reveals them. Clara set her glass down, her perfectly manicured fingers tracing the rim. 4 years ago, I noticed the shift. He became arrogant, cruel. He started gaslighting me about how joint accounts, insisting I was terrible at math, which is hilarious, considering my master's thesis was on predictive economic modeling. He started hiding his bonuses. And then you found out about the women, Josephine noted gently. Brittany wasn't the first, Hara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. There was a paralegal, a real estate agent. He was sloppy. He thought because I wore cheap clothes and didn't ask questions, I was stupid. So I decided to show him exactly how stupid I was. Clara opened the leather folio in front of her, pulling out the FTI consulting report she had memorized cover to cover. I could have divorced him 3 years ago. I could have walked away untouched. But Richard is a predator. If I had just left, he would have done this to someone else. He would have kept stealing, kept lying, kept destroying people. I needed to ensure he could never hold a position of power again. She looked at Thomas. That's why I asked you to establish the Horizon subsidiary. A brilliant move, Thomas agreed. When Chase Bank denied his refinance, you stepped in as the anonymous private equity lender. He was so desperate to get his hands on that cash to fund his mistress's lifestyle. He didn't even read the terms and conditions. The balloon clause was practically printed in bold ink. I gave him enough rope to hang himself, Clara said simply. I waited until he felt invincible. I waited for him to file the divorce so he would be the petitioner. I let him submit those fraudulent financial affidavits to the court, knowing full well he had nearly $1 million sitting in the Cayman Islands. If I had revealed the FTI report before we went to court, he would have just paid a fine and settled. But by letting him swear to it under oath in front of a judge known for his absolute hatred of perjury, you turned a civil divorce dispute into a criminal felony, Josephine finished, her eyes gleaming with professional admiration. By tomorrow morning, the district attorney will have the transcripts. The IRS will freeze his offshore accounts by Friday. And because of the morality clause in his executive contract, which I discreetly mailed a copy of to his CEO an hour ago, he is unemployable. Oh, Coney. Clara turned her gaze back to the window, looking down at the crawling traffic of the city far below. For 10 years she had lived in a prison of beige cardigans, quiet nods, and emotional neglect. She had allowed a mediocre man to believe he was a king, simply so she could learn the exact blueprints of his castle before she detonated it. Her phone chimed on the table. It was an automated alert from the county sheriff's office. The 72-hour eviction notice had been formally served at the Elm Street residence. Clara smiled. It wasn't a smile of malice, but of perfect mathematical balance. The equation had been solved. The debt had been collected. So, Clara, Thomas asked, closing his briefcase with a satisfying click, what is the directive for the trust moving forward now that the dead weight has been liquidated. We restructure, Clara said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. Liquidate the Elm Street property the second he is out. I want the proceeds funneled into the private equity tier. There is a clean energy startup in Boston I've been researching. It's time I stop playing the silent partner and take my rightful seat on the board. Josephine raised her glass one last time. To the real master of the universe. Clara clinked her glass against the attorney's. To the horizon. 6 months later, the brutal Chicago winter had settled over the city, turning the streets into icy gray wind tunnels. But the chill in the air was nothing compared to the permanent freezing dread that now resided in Richard Sterling's bones. He stood behind the scuffed laminate counter of a mid-tier rental car kiosk at O'Hare International Airport, adjusting the collar of his stiff, poorly fitted polyester uniform. The neon fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a headache-inducing hum, illuminating the dark circles under his eyes and the deep, haggard lines that had etched themselves into his face. His custom Italian silk ties and charcoal brownie suits were long gone, liquidated months ago to pay the retainer for a second-rate defense attorney after the court froze his assets. The fallout from courtroom 302 had been absolute and merciless. True to Josephine Reed's promise, the district attorney had received the transcripts. A grand jury had indicted Richard on 2 counts of perjury and 1 count of criminal fraud within 6 weeks. But it was the Internal Revenue Service that had truly broken him. The moment the FTI consulting report detailing his offshore shell company became public record, the IRS swooped in with a civil asset forfeiture order. They didn't just freeze the $800,000 in the Cayman Islands, they seized it, slapping him with an additional $300,000 in penalties, back taxes, and fines. Richard was now officially hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to the federal government. He had tried to reach out to his old contacts in the commercial real estate world, begging for consultancy work or even an entry-level analyst position. Every single door was slammed in his face. Gregory Pierce, his former CEO, had blacklisted him across the entire Midwest. Nobody wanted to hire a man awaiting federal trial for financial crimes. And then there was Brittany. True to her word, she had vanished the day the eviction notice was served on the Elm Street house. She had moved back in with her parents in Ohio, entirely scrubbing Richard from her social media profiles. When she gave birth to a baby girl 2 months ago, Richard wasn't even listed on the birth certificate. Instead, he received a thick manila envelope from the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services, a child support enforcement mandate that would garnish 40% of whatever meager wages he managed to scrape together for the next 18 years. "Excuse me," a sharp voice snapped, pulling Richard out of his bleak reverie. A businessman in a tailored cashmere overcoat was tapping his platinum credit card impatiently on the counter. "I reserved a premium SUV, under Whitaker." Richard swallowed his pride, forcing a tight, humiliating customer service smile onto his face. "Of course, sir. Let me pull up your reservation." His fingers clumsily clacked against the outdated keyboard. For a fleeting, agonizing second, he remembered what it felt like to be the man in the cashmere coat, impatiently demanding the keys to a luxury vehicle while ignoring the invisible workers behind the desk. As the receipt printer whirred to life, Richard's eyes drifted toward the small muted television mounted in the corner of the terminal, permanently tuned to CNBC. The breaking news ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Aferis Energy assures $200 Series C funding. CEO Clara Sterling discusses future of green tech." Richard dropped the rental keys. They clattered loudly onto the laminate counter. The camera on the television zoomed in on the anchor desk. Sitting there, looking radiant, formidable, and utterly untouchable, was Clara. She wore a striking crimson blazer that commanded the room. Her hair was styled in a sleek modern cut, and her posture radiated the absolute confidence of a titan of industry. "Clara," the anchor smiled warmly, "your transition from a quiet private investor to the majority shareholder and CEO of Aferis Energy has been nothing short of meteoric. To what do you owe this sudden aggressive entry into the public business sector?" Clara smiled a genuine, brilliant smile that Richard had never bothered to earn during their decade together. "For a long time I allowed myself to be a silent partner, both in business and in life," Clara answered, her voice smooth and articulate, carrying a weight Richard had never recognized. "I invested my energy into structures and people that ultimately proved to be toxic liabilities. But a few months ago I decided it was time to liquidate those bad investments. Once you remove the dead weight holding you back, you'd be amazed at how quickly you can rise." And at a powerful philosophy, the anchor agreed. "And what is your primary focus moving forward?" "Building a foundation that is transparent, sustainable, and entirely under my own control," Clara stated, her eyes locking briefly with the camera lens. "I spent 10 years observing how arrogance and greed can destroy an empire from the inside out. At Etheirys, we operate on complete honesty, because eventually the truth always comes due." Richard stood frozen, the receipt paper fluttering to the floor. She wasn't just wealthy anymore. She was powerful. She was admired. She was everything he had desperately pretended to be, and she had achieved it by simply destroying the cage he had tried to build around her. "Hey, buddy!" the businessman barked, snapping his fingers in front of Richard's face. "Are you going to give me my keys, or do I need to call your manager?" Richard blinked, tearing his eyes away from the screen. He looked down at his polyester uniform, the worn-out shoes on his feet, and the towering mountain of debt waiting for him in his damp studio apartment. "I'm sorry, sir," Richard whispered, his voice entirely devoid of life as he handed over the keys. "Have a safe trip." He watched the businessman walk away, heading toward the bright, expansive windows of the terminal. Richard looked back up at the television, but the segment was over. Clara was gone, moving steadily forward into her brilliant, limitless horizon, leaving Richard to drown in the shallow, miserable puddle of his own making. What an absolutely incredible story of patience, strategy, and ultimate justice. Clara's ability to endure a decade of arrogance, only to flawlessly dismantle Richard's life with his own lies, is a masterclass in playing the long game. It just goes to show that true power doesn't need to shout, and arrogance is often a man's own worst enemy. Richard thought he held all the cards, but he never realized he was sitting at a table Clara owned. If you love this story of a brilliant wife turning the tables on her toxic husband and securing the ultimate financial revenge, be sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a good courtroom drama, and subscribe for more incredible real-life stories of karma, revenge, and vindication. Let us know in the comments below what would you have done if you were in Clara's shoes. See you in the next video.